This is a conversation between myself and Dave Flint and Peter Manuel on Take Back Your Country. Peter, the big news of the week, of course, is the second lockdown in Victoria, a major lockdown, which is going to have extraordinary consequences on the country. Two leading economists I noticed, a professor from RMIT, Sinclair Davidson, and Warren Hogan from the University of Sydney say that provided there is sustained economic growth, it'll take 2 decades, 20 years, to pay off the debt which has been incurred by governments over this. I remember when this virus began, I'm certainly not an expert, I'm no doctor. I know no more than anybody else on this, except I think I have common sense. When it arose, I came to the conclusion pretty quickly. I began writing about it in 16 articles. I noticed I had 16 pieces about it in Spectator. And I started in March. I'd got back to Australia in February. Started in March, and I realized that there were, I think, 4 important things for any government. First, to strictly control entry. We said we were, but we didn't. When I came back, I noticed there was no supervision, no quarantining at Sydney Airport. I told them where I'd been. There was no even temperature check, and that was towards the end of February. It took a long time for them to tighten up on entry requirements. And the point is, we're not like Sweden. We're not like the United States. We don't have borders with other countries. We are a remote island nation, and there's no excuse for us to not have a much lower impact of the virus than other countries did. And I soon came to realize that, firstly, that was the first thing you had to do. The second thing was to stop the spread. But when I looked at world's best practice, and surely this should have been available to the prime ministers and premiers in the national cabinet and their many, many advisors. I soon realized that world's best practice was Taiwan's, a country the same size of us, but who was getting spectacular results. They ignored Taiwan. They probably ignored Taiwan because the instructions from the communist government was to treat Taiwan as a leper, to take no notice. In fact, they'd forced Taiwan out of even observer status on the World Health Organization. And what Taiwan did in relation to the spread of the virus was not to have these massive lockdowns, which are costing us an incredible amount of money, ruining people's lives, putting young people out of employment, costing a fortune, which will take decades to recover. They realized that you didn't need that, provided you firstly controlled it. You secondly, you tried to control the spread by encouraging sensible hygienic standards and spacing and so on. And the third thing you had to do was especially to protect the vulnerable. The vulnerable depend upon whatever virus is assailing the country. And clearly the vulnerable are the elderly, particularly those who are already sick, even the young who are very sick. And that has been proved all around the world. Those are the ones that you have to really look after. You have to make sure the particularly elderly in the nursing homes are protected from the virus. And there was a fourth thing that I soon came to realize, and that is that we should recover damages. But I specifically argued that you shouldn't do that through the WHO because that was under the control of the communists. It would be silly to do it through the WHO. You just had to have a treaty with like-minded countries and set up a tribunal to come to some conclusions. And then if the communists didn't pay the damages that they'd caused, then you could start seizing property which was theirs, the states, who under the control of the communist state. Now, the Chinese communists are particularly at fault in all of this. There seems to be increasing evidence that the virus escaped from a laboratory. Heaven knows what they were doing to it in the laboratory. But there's still another argument that it came from the wet market. The obviously unsupervised wet market, if that's true. But what they did was, when they knew the virus was spreading in China, they didn't tell the world. They told the WHO lies, and the WHO, under their control, repeated those lies. And while they were locking down in Wuhan and around that area, they let it escape to the rest of the world. And the costs have been enormous in the rest of the world. Costs exaggerated by I think, the overreaction in relation to having these heavy lockdowns, which many scientists say are not necessary. I think world's best practice in Taiwan has demonstrated that. So those were the 4 points that I came to, without having any special knowledge, but I think with common sense. And the governments have not acted with common sense. They've panicked. They've been persuaded by modelling from sources which are notorious for exaggerated modelling. And the result is an enormous burden on the Australian people. And the Andrews government has made this even worse. They've greatly increased the burden on the Australian people. It's not only the burden of people losing their jobs and businesses being closed down, but people also being frightened into not going to the doctors. Other serious illnesses are not being properly treated. People are being driven to considering taking their lives because they're losing businesses and employment. The country is in a complete mess. And I don't think our politicians have in any way shown any leadership in this matter. And they've also, as you know, been guilty of double standards constantly. When the so-called Black Lives Matter, which is a communist-controlled organization from America, when the followers of that decided to initiate protests in Australia, the initial response of all the members of the National Cabinet seemed to be, oh, well, it's important to let the protest go ahead. The public reacted strongly against that, so they started tightening up on that, although Victoria allowed theirs to go ahead, and they decided not to prosecute those involved, although they seem to prosecute everybody else. So the situation is a complete mess. There is a terrible double standard. And we've seen that, Peter, you've mentioned to me, and you'll no doubt talk about this. The Liberal Party had a big function in Adelaide, vast numbers of people. They arranged for it to have many more than anybody else can have. And in New South Wales, although churches were closed in New South Wales and then only allowed to open on very tight requirements, a permission was granted to a mosque to have a function on a special day, special for the Muslims, as Easter special for Christians, as Anzac Day is special for Australians. They were allowed to have 400 people gathering in a mosque in Sydney. Double standards, no criticism of the Muslims, criticism of the government of New South Wales in having these double standards. And you have examples of that in Adelaide, Peter.
Yes, David. Look, I don't know whether you can see me because my screen's gone black, so I can't see you, and I don't know whether you can see me at the moment.
I can indeed.
Okay, then, well, I'll keep talking. David, yes, everything you've mentioned, spot on again as usual, and good to have this chat. Common sense, that's what we need. We're sick and tired of hearing about scientists and all the rest, and we've got to be very, very careful what scientists we listen to and who's paying that scientist to tell us certain things. What worries me, I see and I hear a lot of stuff, and I hear that hospitals get more money, allegedly, if they put down that somebody's passed away with this Chinese virus. There was a person on Facebook was saying how their father was very, very ill in hospital, terminal cancer, didn't have long to live. He was put in the nursing home now and died the next day. They put it down as the Chinese virus. Well, number one, he died the next day, he was put in this nursing home. So I wouldn't have thought that if he had the Chinese virus, he would have been allowed back in the nursing home. And secondly, if this is true, why are these hospitals getting more money if they put down on a death certificate that somebody has passed away because of this Chinese virus? This is corruption at its best. So where's all this coming from? And another thing too, David, I'd like to bring up, if I may, in regards to Daniel Andrews. I think he's made an absolute mess, and people in Victoria should be absolutely up in arms, because how Victoria are going to recover from this, I just don't know. I really don't. And what worries me is, and this is only my view, if we look at Daniel's, how he's officially, by all accounts, engaged in this ridiculous $24.5 billion Belt and Road Initiative, the Communist Chinese Party are going to come in and build all this infrastructure. But by all accounts, if a country can't pay for the work that has been done on this infrastructure, there's a clause in the agreement that Beijing can seize the asset. So does that mean they could seize Victoria? Because they already got the Port of Melbourne leased for 50 years. And Daniel Andrews is going to absolutely make a crook old mess of this place. I'm starting to think, what's going on here? Is this all been orchestrated? Because it's very, very strange, David. I don't trust politicians anymore. I don't trust the communist Chinese at all. And I must say, I've got Chinese friends, and there is a lot of decent Chinese people out there that don't like what's going on. David.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. This is a criticism not of the Chinese people, but of the Beijing government, the Communist Party of China. It's very clear that the Chinese people probably don't want to live under such a government. They made that very clear for many years when they did anything they could do to get to Hong Kong, even swimming through shark-infested waters to get to a crown colony, a British crown colony of Hong Kong. The Chinese people have shown in recent times in Taiwan, in voting against the pro-Beijing party in the elections overwhelmingly, and they did the same in the local government elections in Hong Kong. So much so that now, with the communists taking over Hong Kong and ending the two systems, breaking the treaty with the United Kingdom, they've decided now to delay the elections which were to take place in Hong Kong until next year, for the obvious reason that they know that any parties favourable to Beijing would do very badly in the Hong Kong elections. We must, I think, assume that the Chinese people don't want this government. They're happy that a system of state socialism has been brought in, which they borrowed from the teachings of Mussolini, where the corporations are completely under the control of the ruling party. They're happy that at least aspects of the market economy have been brought in. That was brought in by the communists because they saw what happened in the Soviet Union. It was brought in as a last-ditch attempt to save communism, and they certainly delayed it. And through the foolishness of Western governments, who've handed over so much to them, handed over manufacturing, allowed them to breach the conditions of the World Trade Organization when they admitted them, allowed them to either steal or somehow otherwise acquire the intellectual property of the West. All of this has happened because there are elements in the West, including Australia, who are doing a very good thing. They're making a lot of money out of China, or they're just what Lenin called useful idiots. Mm-hmm. These are sort of useful idiots, as Lenin said, the capitalists who would even sell them the rope with which Lenin would hang the capitalists. That is the situation in relation to the communists. It's an appalling situation. And I think you're quite right to criticize the ruling parties, both Labour and Coalition, for having double standards in so many ways. And I don't think the people of Australia accept that. Peter.
No, they certainly don't, David. You mentioned about the mosque having 400 people in New South Wales there in Sydney. And you also mentioned in regards to the Liberal Party here in South Australia last night. Yes, they invited 700 people and allegedly 500 turned up. And our Premier, Stephen Marshall of the Liberal Party, said that, they'll be doing everything right and so on. But, we can only have 100 people at a funeral and at a wedding. Well, those people could be doing everything right. You're right when you mention double standards. There's certainly double standards here. And I think the sheer arrogance by going ahead with this was absolutely disgusting. And Stephen Marshall's going to lose a lot of, he was riding high there for a while, but he's going to lose a lot of people that thought that he was doing a good job. When you look at, we're only allowed to have 10 people in our private homes. I've got 5 children and 7 grandchildren, so I can't have all of them home at once. But you can have up to 700 at the Adelaide Oval for a Liberal function. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting, David, the way we're being treated, the double standards, the two-facedness by these politicians on all sides. I think with our interviews that we do, and we mentioned Australians take back your country, that's what's got to happen, because we are not being represented properly by these politicians. I think the Liberal National Party and the Labor Party and the Greens are all together, and I think it's a disgrace what is happening to this country. And you just can't keep locking down and destroying people's lives, their businesses, their future, their prosperity. You can't keep doing it. But they tell us it's for the good of us. No, it's not. I think we've got to get out there and if you're healthy, keep your distance, keep your hygiene up. I mean, I see people driving cars, one person in a car wearing a mask. You've got to ask yourself, are these people Looney Tunes? I think it's an absolute joke, David. On that note, I don't think my phone's going to last too long. If you'd like to make a comment, I need to adjust and plug into a PowerPoint, and maybe we can talk a bit longer in a few minutes.
Yes, just on that question of what we should do, and perhaps we'll have an interval, bring this conversation to an end and start again.
That'll be great, Dave.
Just on that question of what to do, in Victoria, as in most other states, as you have in the Commonwealth, the checks on a government were firstly and they still are in the lower house. It's always open to the lower house to move against a government. This would seem unlikely in Victoria because they do have a solid majority there. There may be a change within the party. The last time I think it happened in Victoria that the lower house, the Assembly, effectively removed the government was when the Labor Party split, when the Democratic Labour Party was formed because a number of Labour politicians objected to the takeover of the major Labour Party by communists who were moving into the unions and also into the party. That happened under John Cain. But there was also a provision in Victoria and in other states for the upper house. The upper house could always reject supply and bring down a government. And that did happen up to 9 times in Victoria. A number of times not to bring down the government just because they were rejecting financial considerations. But all that's gone away. In 2003, that was taken away by all the parties acting together. So there's no way of removing a government in Victoria unless the lower house moves a vote of no confidence, which is most unlikely. What we should have, among the number of things that we're proposing, are recall elections. Politicians have to be subjected to controls. They have to be made accountable. And one of the 5 R's, which we've proposed, that a convention, there'd have to be enormous agitation for a popularly elected convention to take place. But one of the measures which could be brought in is to make all governments subject to recall elections, which happen in some American states and other jurisdictions in the world. This involves a certain percentage of the electorate, say 5% of the electorate, coming out and deciding that they feel that the government has had its day and signing a petition. They have to put their names and addresses down. It's a very public act, and people are not, they don't do that unless they really mean it, whatever percentage is required. And once that petition is filled within a certain period, a re-election is ordered, either in a specific electorate or across all electorates. That can happen. And this is one of the matters which we think should be considered by a constitutional convention as part of the 5 R's for major reform to make the parliaments of Australia accountable. Now, on that point, I think I'll draw this to a conclusion, allow you, Peter, to rearrange your power outlet, and we'll come back together in about 5 minutes' time.
That'll be great, David. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.